The air in the police station was thick with tension. Karen's hands trembled around the cold, steel grip of the gun. Her eyes darted from the officer in front of her to the door, where she imagined the arrival of more officers, more questions. The world had been closing in on her for days, ever since the murder. It was supposed to be a simple misunderstanding, a neighbor's death blown out of proportion, but now, as Karen's heart raced in her chest, everything had changed. She had made a mistake. A big mistake. The officer took a cautious step forward, his voice a calm contrast to the storm raging inside her. "Karen," he said, trying to de-escalate. "Put the gun down. Let's talk this through." Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of the gun suddenly unbearable. She had never wanted this, never wanted to be here, not in the middle of a police station, not with a dead officer on the floor. But she was trapped. She thought the shooting would be the end of it, but in that moment, Karen realized something far worse was looming on the horizon. The gunshot echoed through the station, too loud, too final. Karen's eyes locked onto the officer's, now wide with shock, as he crumpled to the floor. His uniform stained with blood. She thought she was being arrested for a crime she didn't commit. A murder. But the reality was far more twisted, far more sinister. The truth that would come out in the following hours would turn everything she knew upside down. What had Karen just done? And who, really, was the victim here? The answers were coming. But they were darker than she ever could have imagined. Karen had always felt the weight of eyes on her. It wasn't just the usual watchful gazes from neighbors or strangers, it was something more unsettling, a pressure that built inside her chest with every step she took. Living on the outskirts of a small town, in a house that had seen better days, Karen had always kept to herself. Her neighbors knew little about her past, but they were quick to form opinions, to make judgments. She didn't mind, at least not at first. But everything changed the day her neighbor, Mrs. Lancaster, was found dead. At first, Karen didn't understand what the fuss was about. Mrs. Lancaster had been old, too old to be living alone in a big house, some said. But others whispered darker things, things Karen couldn't ignore. They said Mrs. Lancaster's death wasn't natural. That someone had been involved. And it didn't take long for the rumors to latch onto Karen. She hadn't seen Mrs. Lancaster the night before. She hadn't heard from her for days. Was she hiding something? Was she somehow involved? For Karen, the whispers grew louder every day. The suspicion crept into every interaction, every glance. At the local grocery store, at the post office, and even in her own home, she could feel it. The judgment. The assumption. They thought she had something to do with it. After all, Karen didn't have an alibi, and she had been the one person who lived closest to the Lancaster house. But was it her fault? Was there something she missed? Something she couldn't remember? Karen couldn't shake the nagging feeling that all the signs pointed to her. She had only ever interacted with Mrs. Lancaster on a handful of occasions, friendly exchanges over the fence, or when Karen had helped the elderly woman carry her groceries once or twice, but that was it. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would explain the rumors. Yet, in the eyes of the townsfolk, she was the one who stood out. She was the one who was too quiet, too mysterious. And soon enough, she became the prime suspect. Her paranoia twisted every thought, every decision. She began to think the worst of every encounter. A knock at her door could be the police, asking her questions, wanting to search her house. A car slowing down outside her window felt like an investigation. Was she being watched? Karen didn't know how much longer she could take it. Every night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possibility, every scenario. What if they were right? What if the rumors had a grain of truth? The police had been around often, asking questions, taking statements. They had questioned Karen multiple times, each time a little more pressing, a little more insistent. And with each visit, Karen could feel the pressure mounting. They didn't believe her. They didn't trust her. The words of the police officer echoed in her mind, "It's just a matter of time, Karen. We'll find out the truth." The worst part was the silence. The guilt she carried, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, was crushing. It was as though the very air around her had become charged with suspicion. Karen found herself avoiding the eyes of her neighbors when they walked by. She stopped answering the phone unless she knew who was calling. Every text message, every knock on the door felt like it could be the moment everything collapsed. And then came the call from the police. They wanted her to come down to the station. She was being questioned again. But this time, it was different. They weren't asking the same questions they had before. They weren't asking about Mrs. Lancaster's health or when the last time Karen saw her was. This time, they had something new. They had evidence. Evidence that seemed to point directly at her. They wanted her to come in. Not as a witness anymore, but as a suspect. Karen's hands had trembled as she hung up the phone. Her heart had pounded in her chest. They were closing in. She could feel it, like a tightening noose. There was no escape. She had to go down to the station. But as she got dressed, as she tried to compose herself, the thought crossed her mind, what if they already knew? What if they knew everything? Her worst fear was coming true. The idea that she might be arrested for a crime she hadn't committed was too much to bear. But what if there was more? What if the police weren't just looking at her for the murder? What if they knew something she didn't? What if she was being set up for something even worse? By the time Karen arrived at the station, her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and dread. She didn't even notice the officer who greeted her at the door. She just wanted answers. She just wanted to prove that she wasn't the murderer they all thought she was. But as she walked through the sterile halls of the police station, each step felt like it was leading her closer to a trap she couldn't escape. And then, standing in front of the officer she had known for years, everything changed. The look in his eyes told her something was terribly wrong. "Karen," he had said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." The door had shut behind her with a finality she hadn't expected. She wasn't ready for what would happen next. What she didn't know was that the truth she had been avoiding, the truth she had feared, was far worse than anything she could have imagined. And the consequences would be more devastating than a simple arrest. The days leading up to the shooting were a blur of unease and dread for Karen. Each morning, she awoke with a sense of doom hanging over her, as though the walls of her home were closing in around her. The air felt thick, suffocating, and her once peaceful existence had become a pressure cooker ready to burst. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the door, made her jump. She could feel the weight of the rumors pressing down on her, the endless whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It all started with the death of Mrs. Lancaster. Her neighbor, the old woman who had lived alone in the house next door, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. At first, the community tried to brush it off, dismissing it as an unfortunate accident. But Karen knew better. The way the neighbors spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening, there was something darker at play. The police had come by her house again the morning after the body was discovered. They had asked the same questions over and over. When was the last time you saw Mrs. Lancaster? Did she have any visitors recently? Were you in contact with her the night she died? Each time, Karen had given the same answer. She had no idea. She hadn't seen Mrs. Lancaster in days. But the look in their eyes told her they didn't believe her. They were searching for something, and Karen couldn't help but feel that they were looking at her as the prime suspect. She was their scapegoat, their easy answer. Her mind raced. Was it possible she had missed something? Had she inadvertently triggered something that led to Mrs. Lancaster's death? She could remember little details, like how the old woman had seemed to be watching her more closely than usual in the days before her death, how their last conversation had felt oddly strained, but nothing significant. At least, that's what she told herself. But the more she thought about it, the more her mind spiraled. She began to doubt herself. Had there been a confrontation between them? Had she said something to Mrs. Lancaster that might have led her to take drastic action? She couldn't recall. It felt like the edges of her memory were slipping away, like a fog closing in around her thoughts. Was she going crazy? Or had something much darker happened that she wasn't even aware of? Karen's interactions with the police officers who came by only added to her growing paranoia. Officer Daniels, the lead investigator, had been particularly persistent. He was a man of few words, but his stare was unnerving. Every time Karen looked at him, she felt like he could see right through her. As the days passed, Daniels appeared more frequently at her door, always with a new question, a new line of inquiry. His presence was constant, like a shadow that never left her. His cold eyes seemed to follow her every move, and no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she was innocent, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels was closing in on her. But it wasn't just the police that made Karen feel trapped. The town, too, had begun to turn against her. At the local grocery store, the cashier avoided making eye contact. The neighbors whispered behind their hands, their faces shadowed with suspicion. Even those who had once been friendly with her now kept their distance, their smiles tight and forced. It was as if everyone had already made up their minds about her, and there was no way to undo the damage. The social isolation began to gnaw at her sanity. She could barely leave her house without feeling like every person she passed was judging her, scrutinizing her every step. The only place Karen felt even a shred of peace was within the walls of her home. But even that was starting to crumble. Every creak of the old floorboards in the hallway sent a spike of fear through her chest. Every knock at the door made her stomach lurch. She couldn't even open the curtains without feeling like someone was watching her. Was it the neighbors? The police? Or was it just her own mind, unraveling under the pressure? But the worst part was the police station. She had been summoned there several times now, each visit more nerve-wracking than the last. They had called her in for questioning, each time digging deeper into her past. The questions were always the same, but they were getting sharper, more pointed. They asked about her relationship with Mrs. Lancaster, about the last time they had spoken, about anything and everything that could be connected to the murder. Karen had been careful with her answers, cautious not to reveal too much, but she could feel their suspicion growing. It was as if they were waiting for her to slip up, to reveal something that could tie her to the crime. And then, just when Karen thought things couldn't get worse, Officer Daniels appeared at her door again. This time, he had a different look on his face, a look that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no polite small talk, no friendly gestures. He had come for one reason, and he wasn't going to leave without getting what he wanted. "You need to come down to the station," he had said, his voice cold and flat. "It's not a request, Karen. We have new evidence." Karen had tried to protest, to ask what evidence he was talking about, but he didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, her hands shaking and her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to go to the station. But what awaited her at the station was something she hadn't anticipated. As soon as she stepped inside the sterile, cold building, the tension hit her like a physical force. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air felt suffocating. She had been questioned here before, but this time it was different. This time, the atmosphere was heavy, charged with something dark and dangerous. And standing at the far end of the room, watching her with those unblinking eyes, was Officer Daniels. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He just stared, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, disappointment? Anger? Or was it something worse? Karen's throat went dry. She was caught in the web of her own lies, and there was no way out. As she walked towards the interrogation room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything would change. This was the moment when her fate would be sealed. She didn't know how, but she could feel it. Something was going to happen, something that would change everything. The officer's eyes never left her as she passed. The small town didn't know how to handle the rumors surrounding Karen. Was she a victim of circumstances, or had she crossed a line? As the door to the interrogation room swung shut behind her, Karen knew that whatever happened next, she wouldn't be able to escape the consequences. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a thick fog that seemed to press down on Karen from every direction. The door had slammed shut behind her as soon as she entered, sealing her inside the cold, clinical space of the interrogation room. She had expected this, the cold, detached atmosphere that seemed to swallow all emotions, but she hadn't expected the overwhelming wave of dread that hit her the moment she sat down. The familiar feeling of being watched, of being judged, was amplified here, where even the walls seemed to whisper her guilt. Officer Daniels stood across from her, his gaze fixed on her as though he could see every secret she'd tried to bury. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he repeated the same line he had said a dozen times before, "We just need the truth, Karen. You can tell us. It's the only way we can help you." But Karen wasn't sure she had the truth. Her mind was spinning. She couldn't remember the last time she felt so disconnected from reality. She couldn't remember a time when the world had felt so far out of her control. The fear that had been steadily building inside her now felt like a living, breathing thing, something that was tightening around her chest with every breath she took. She had never felt this out of place. The officer's voice, despite its calm, seemed like an accusation in itself. "We know you were close to Mrs. Lancaster," Daniels continued, his words cutting through the silence. "Your connection with her was the last thing anyone saw. It's not too late to be honest, Karen." But honesty, what did that even mean anymore? Karen wasn't sure she even knew the truth anymore. She could feel the panic creeping up her throat, the heat in her cheeks, the overwhelming need to defend herself, to shout out that she had nothing to do with this. But the words wouldn't come. The room felt too small, the air too thick. And then, as if the walls themselves were closing in, her hand reached for the gun. It wasn't something she had consciously decided to do. The gun had been left on the table in front of her, just out of reach, almost mocking her as it sat there. But in that moment, it seemed to call to her, beckoning her like a lifeline. She had never even touched a gun before. But now, in the frenzy of her racing heart, she grasped it, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal. Her mind was a whirlwind, chaotic thoughts spinning faster than she could process. She could hear Daniel's voice, still calm, still trying to coax her into speaking, but it felt distant now, as though coming from underwater. "Karen, put the gun down," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a firmer tone, his hand moving slightly toward his own holster. "You don't want to do this." But Karen didn't know what she wanted anymore. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, the rapid pulse of fear running through her veins. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, and everything in the room seemed to blur except for the gun, the officer's steady gaze, and her own panic-stricken thoughts. Time seemed to slow as she raised the gun, her fingers pressing against the trigger. The officer was still speaking, still trying to reason with her, but his words didn't register. The room was suffocating her, the sound of his voice now just a distant hum. And then, in the instant it took to pull the trigger, everything shifted. The sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the room. Karen's ears rang with the noise, and the world around her seemed to freeze. She stared at the officer in front of her, wide-eyed and shaking, as he staggered backward. His face contorted in shock and pain as he fell to the ground, his hand instinctively reaching for his side where the blood began to pool. The gunshot had come so quickly, so unexpectedly, that it was as though everything had been wiped away in a single moment. Her body went numb, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room around her seemed to spin as the officer's breath hitched in the silence, his hand gripping the floor, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. Karen's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a harsh reminder of what she had just done. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at the bloodstain slowly spreading across the floor, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The reality of it hit her with force, crashing down on her like a wave. She hadn't meant to do this. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She had only wanted to defend herself, to prove her innocence, to escape the suffocating pressure of the police station, the crushing weight of the accusations. But now, she had done something unforgivable. The officer, the very man who had come to question her, was now lying in a pool of his own blood, and it was her fault. Panic surged through her body, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she dropped the gun onto the table. It felt as though the room was closing in around her, the walls pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The blood on the floor seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of the life she had just taken, a life that she never intended to end. The officer's groans filled the room, his body twitching slightly as he tried to move, but it was clear he was losing consciousness. Karen could feel her legs give way beneath her, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor, her back pressed against the wall. She couldn't think. She couldn't feel anything except the overwhelming sense of terror that gripped her. What had she done? Her mind was in overdrive, racing through the events that had led to this moment. She had never intended for any of this to happen. She had just wanted to survive, to get out of the suffocating atmosphere that had been building around her. But now, with the officer unconscious and the blood staining the floor, she knew there was no going back. The consequences of her actions were irreversible. In the distance, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The chaos, the panic, the realization that everything she had feared had come true, it was all happening now, all in this one moment. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The world outside the interrogation room had already started to react. The police station was no longer a place of questioning, it had become the scene of a crime. And Karen was at the center of it, trapped in the web of her own desperation. The sound of the gunshots still echoed in Karen's ears as she slumped against the cold, sterile wall of the interrogation room. But in the midst of the chaos, her mind drifted, back to days and weeks before the incident, back to the moments when everything began to shift, when the seed of doubt was first planted in her mind. The whispers, the glances, the unsettling feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. It had started innocently enough, like most things do. Karen had lived a quiet, uneventful life in the small suburban neighborhood. Her house, tucked away on the corner of Maple Street, was modest, but it was hers. She had worked hard to maintain it, spending hours on the weekends tending to the garden and fixing up little things that needed attention. She preferred solitude, it was easier that way. But her routine, her predictable life, was about to be shattered. Mrs. Lancaster, the elderly woman who lived next door, had always been a bit of a mystery. Karen didn't know much about her, other than the fact that she had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. Their interactions had always been brief, when Karen helped her carry groceries inside, or when they exchanged pleasantries over the fence. But there had been something about Mrs. Lancaster that always made Karen uneasy. The woman's eyes, sharp and observant, always seemed to be watching her. It wasn't malicious, Karen told herself. It was just that Mrs. Lancaster had lived a long life, and like most elderly people, she enjoyed keeping an eye on the neighborhood. But one particular conversation had stuck with Karen long after it had ended. It had been a crisp autumn afternoon when Mrs. Lancaster stopped her in the front yard as Karen was pruning the rose bushes. She had asked, in a low, almost conspiratorial voice, "Have you heard the rumors, dear? About your neighbors? About what happens behind closed doors?" Karen had been taken aback by the question, unsure of how to respond. "Rumors?" she had asked. Mrs. Lancaster had just smiled, a cryptic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "People talk, Karen. Always talking. And it's dangerous to be the one who doesn't listen." The words lingered in the air like smoke, swirling around Karen's mind long after the conversation ended. She had laughed it off at the time, but now, in the quiet moments when the house was still, she wondered what Mrs. Lancaster had truly meant by that. What did she know? What had she seen? Weeks passed, and life went on. Karen tried to push the conversation out of her mind. But then, things started to change. Karen began to notice Mrs. Lancaster watching her more closely. It was subtle at first, lingering glances over the fence, long stares when their paths crossed in the street. But it grew harder to ignore as time went on. Karen could feel the eyes of her neighbor on her, always watching, always waiting for something. It made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't quite place why. It was the week before Mrs. Lancaster's death that Karen first began to sense that something wasn't right. The air was thick with tension. The mailman had come by, dropping off a package at Mrs. Lancaster's door. Karen had been working in the garden when she noticed the package. It wasn't unusual, Mrs. Lancaster often received deliveries. But this time, there had been something different about the way the package was placed. As if the delivery was intentional, as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure Karen noticed. That evening, Karen had gone to bed feeling restless, the image of the package nagging at her. But she woke up the next morning to something far worse. The police were at Mrs. Lancaster's house. She had been found dead, lying in her own home under mysterious circumstances. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. The initial shock gave way to confusion, and then to suspicion. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the rumors began to spread like wildfire. People whispered behind closed doors, exchanged knowing glances, and soon, Karen felt as though she were the target of those whispers. They all assumed she was somehow involved. It didn't help that Karen had been one of the last people to see Mrs. Lancaster alive. The last time they had spoken was just days before her death. Mrs. Lancaster had stopped her again in the front yard, this time with a strange, almost manic urgency in her voice. "You've got to watch out, Karen," she had said, her voice trembling. "People can't be trusted. Everyone has secrets. Even you." Karen hadn't understood what she meant, but the words had haunted her ever since. The next few days were a blur. The police came by often, asking her the same questions over and over. Had she seen anything unusual? Had she heard anything strange? Had she and Mrs. Lancaster been close? Karen had answered their questions, trying to maintain her composure, but each time they came, the pressure mounted. They weren't asking the same questions they had before. They were asking for more. The accusations were becoming harder to ignore, harder to push aside. It wasn't just the police who were asking questions. It was the neighbors too. They began to look at Karen differently. The polite smiles disappeared, replaced by stares full of judgment. People who had once been friendly to her now turned their backs, avoiding eye contact. And then there were the whispers. In the grocery store, at the post office, at the local cafe, everywhere Karen went, she could feel the weight of the rumors hanging over her. She was being watched. She was being judged. She was being painted as the one who had something to hide. The walls were closing in. Karen had always been a private person. She kept to herself, avoided confrontation, and did her best to stay out of the spotlight. But now, she felt as though she were standing at the center of a storm, and there was no escape. The more the police questioned her, the more she began to doubt herself. What if they were right? What if she had missed something, some small detail that could explain everything? What if she had known more than she was willing to admit? The guilt gnawed at her, eating away at her sanity. She hadn't done anything wrong, she told herself. She hadn't killed Mrs. Lancaster. But the more the police questioned her, the more she wondered if maybe she was hiding something from herself. Could she have been involved in a way she couldn't remember? Could she have said something, done something, that set things in motion without even realizing it? But even as the guilt consumed her, there was another feeling, a feeling of betrayal. Karen had always tried to be kind to Mrs. Lancaster. She had helped her with groceries, mowed her lawn when she couldn't do it herself, and always made sure she had someone to talk to. So why had Mrs. Lancaster looked at her with such suspicion? Why had she warned her about secrets, about people who couldn't be trusted? It didn't make sense. And the more Karen thought about it, the more she realized that she might never understand what had really happened. But one thing was clear: the town, the police, and everyone else had already made up their minds. They had already cast her as the villain in this tragedy, and there was no way to change that. As Karen sat there, waiting for the inevitable consequences to unfold, her mind kept drifting back to those words: people can't be trusted. Everyone has secrets. Even you. She didn't know what they meant. She didn't know what Mrs. Lancaster had known, or what had driven her to say those things. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, Karen wondered if she would ever find out. Would the truth ever come to light? Or would it remain buried, a mystery she could never solve? And as she stared at the officer on the floor, blood pooling around him, Karen realized that the truth might be the one thing she could never escape. The sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air as Karen sat in the same interrogation room where her life had irrevocably shifted. The walls around her seemed to pulse with the weight of her guilt. It wasn't just the officer on the floor, the blood slowly congealing at his side, that haunted her. It was the dread of what was about to come. The silence of the room felt suffocating, pressing down on her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her body was frozen, and her mind was a tangled mess, struggling to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. The door creaked open, and in walked Detective Simmons, a tall, imposing figure whose presence immediately filled the room. His sharp eyes swept over her, noting the trembling hands and the pallor of her face, but he said nothing. The door clicked shut behind him, and the heavy silence returned. The faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead seemed deafening in the stillness. Simmons pulled a chair across the floor with a screech that made Karen's skin crawl and sat down opposite her. He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, as if trying to read the thoughts racing through her mind. "Karen," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what happened. Everything." Her breath hitched in her throat. What could she say? She had no idea how it had come to this. How had she gone from being a quiet, solitary woman to someone sitting here, accused of murder? "Detective. I didn't mean to," Karen's voice cracked, and she could barely bring herself to look at him. "I didn't mean to shoot him. It all just happened so fast." Simmons leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched her closely. "I'm not here to judge you, Karen. I need you to be honest with me. What happened in that room? Why did you shoot Officer Daniels?" The question sent a cold wave over her, and she shuddered involuntarily. Officer Daniels. The man she had spoken to countless times before. The one who had interrogated her, made her feel like a criminal long before this moment. She didn't know what had gone wrong, she had just wanted answers, but now, her mind was a maze of confusion. "I don't know," Karen whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "It just felt like I was being cornered. Like they were about to arrest me for something I didn't do, and I panicked." Simmons didn't respond immediately. Instead, he flipped open a notebook, scribbling something down. The sound of his pen against paper seemed louder than usual, amplifying the dread building inside her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The detective looked back up at her, his expression unreadable. "You panicked. But what happened right before that? What was going through your mind when you grabbed the gun?" The question sliced through her like a blade. Karen squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the memory to the surface, but it felt like trying to grasp smoke. She could still see the gun on the table in front of her, the cold steel gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. She could still hear Daniel's voice, steady but edged with suspicion, telling her that they had new evidence. What evidence? What had they found that made them so sure of her guilt? Karen began, but her voice faltered. She wasn't sure she could even trust her own thoughts. The details were slipping through her fingers. I thought he was going to arrest me. I thought he had the evidence to prove I was guilty. Of what, Karen? Simmons interrupted. Of what crime? Of murder? Karen recoiled at the word, her heart pounding. She hadn't killed anyone. She hadn't. But the evidence, the accusations, the way the town had turned on her, it was all starting to blur. Was she guilty? Was she somehow responsible for this? I didn't do it. Karen's voice broke as she clutched the edge of the table, as if the physical contact could anchor her to reality. I didn't kill Mrs. Lancaster. I didn't. I don't even know how I ended up here. It wasn't me. It was everything. Everything was closing in on me, and her words trailed off as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had never truly understood why the police had suspected her in the first place, why they had treated her like a criminal from the beginning. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if her own fear and confusion had driven her to make choices she could never take back. The gunshot, the officer on the floor, was this all her fault? Simmons' voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. We have a few things that might help jog your memory, Karen. We found your fingerprints on the gun. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes widened, and she froze, her mind scrambling to make sense of this new revelation. She had touched the gun. She had picked it up, had held it in her hands. But why had she done that? It had been instinct, hadn't it? She didn't remember picking it up. It was like the world had tilted sideways, and everything had happened in flashes, too quick for her to fully comprehend. But the detective wasn't done. We also spoke to some of the neighbors. They mentioned that you'd been acting a bit unusual, Karen. Especially around the time of Mrs. Lancaster's death. Can you explain that? The weight of the question hit her like a punch to the gut. Of course, they had spoken to the neighbors. Everyone had an opinion about her. The stares, the whispers, they were all there in the back of her mind, but she had never really thought about them. They had all judged her, assumed the worst, and now, it seemed like their opinions were part of the puzzle they were trying to piece together. Could she blame them? She had never been one to be open, to let people in. Maybe it had been too easy for them to see her as the guilty party, the one hiding secrets, the one with something to hide. I was scared, Karen muttered, her voice low and shaky. They were all looking at me, judging me. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I thought they had already decided what happened to Mrs. Lancaster, and they were just waiting for me to crack, to admit something I didn't do. Simmons didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, letting her words hang in the air like an unspoken accusation. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head slightly. Karen, I know this is hard, but you need to understand. We're trying to find the truth. If you keep shutting us out, we can't help you. You need to tell us everything. Everything. But Karen didn't know what everything meant anymore. She didn't know what was real, what was a memory, and what was a nightmare. She could feel the truth slipping further away from her grasp, like sand running through her fingers. And as the hours stretched on in that cold, dimly lit room, Karen began to question not just the police, but herself. What had happened that night? Had she really shot Officer Daniels in self-defense? Or had she crossed a line, pushed too far by fear, by paranoia, by the weight of the world closing in on her? But there was one thing Karen knew for sure, she was at the center of it all. And no matter how much she wanted to deny it, the investigation would continue. The walls were closing in. And somewhere, hidden among the lies and the evidence, was the truth she couldn't yet see. The interrogation room was eerily quiet, the hum of the fluorescent light above echoing in Karen's ears. She sat across from Detective Simmons, her hands still trembling from the emotional storm that had raged through her since the shooting. She had given him everything she could, her fear, her confusion, her guilt, but it hadn't been enough. She had tried to convince herself that the truth would set her free, but all she'd felt was the crushing weight of suspicion, as though she were sinking deeper into a pit she couldn't escape. Simmons had been quiet for a while now, his fingers tapping slowly on his notebook, his eyes never leaving her. She had expected him to interrogate her further, to question her motives, her actions, but instead, he was studying her in silence, like a chess player waiting for the right moment to make his move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice steady, calm, but with a chilling undercurrent. "You know, Karen," he began, leaning forward slightly, "we've been digging into your neighbor's past. Mrs. Lancaster, the one you're supposedly connected to." Karen's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "What? What do you mean? I've already told you everything about her, about me." Her voice was hoarse, filled with anxiety. She wasn't ready for more questions about Mrs. Lancaster. She had already replayed every moment in her mind 1,000 times, and the thought of doing it again made her stomach churn. Simmons didn't seem to notice her distress. He continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "We found something interesting, something that wasn't clear at first. Mrs. Lancaster wasn't the victim you thought she was." Karen felt the ground beneath her shift. The words didn't make sense. How could that be? Mrs. Lancaster had been found dead in her own home, bloodied and lifeless. How could she not be the victim? Wasn't that why Karen had been interrogated for days? Wasn't that why everyone in town had started to view her as a suspect? The weight of that suspicion felt like a stone in her chest. "What do you mean?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Simmons leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "We've been running some background checks on Mrs. Lancaster. Turns out, she wasn't just an old woman living alone. She had connections to some very dangerous people. People who wouldn't think twice about eliminating anyone who got in their way." Karen stared at him, her mind racing. Dangerous people? But, she was just an old lady. I never saw anything, no one ever came to visit her." Simmons gave her a knowing look, almost pitying. "Mrs. Lancaster had a secret life, Karen. She was involved in something much bigger than you realized. And from the looks of it, you were unknowingly caught in the middle of it." Karen's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. Mrs. Lancaster, her seemingly sweet, fragile neighbor, was part of something criminal? She couldn't fathom it. The woman had always been polite, even if a little distant, but Karen had never imagined anything sinister behind her actions. "Are you saying Mrs. Lancaster was involved in some sort of crime?" Karen asked, trying to steady her breathing, but the walls of the room were closing in, suffocating her. Simmons nodded. "Yes, but it's not just that. We've discovered that the murder wasn't meant for her, it was meant for someone else. Someone much closer to you than you realize." Karen's blood ran cold. "What? No, no one else was involved." But Simmons cut her off. "You don't know the whole story yet, Karen. This murder, this whole mess, it wasn't about Mrs. Lancaster at all. It was about you." The word struck her like a blow to the chest. She stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "What do you mean it was about me? What do I have to do with any of this?" Simmons leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "It's all tied to you. Your past, Karen. The things you've been running from. The things you thought you could bury." Karen's mind whirled. Her past? What was he talking about? She had a simple life, one that she had worked hard to keep private, far from the eyes of anyone who might try to dig into it. She had never done anything worth hiding, at least, that's what she had believed. She had no idea what Simmons was implying, but she couldn't deny the gnawing fear that had begun to creep into her gut. Simmons continued, unfazed by her shock. "Your father, Karen. He wasn't just a mechanic. He had debts that spiraled out of control. And when he couldn't pay them off, he made a deal with the wrong people. People who don't forget. People who make sure their debts are paid, one way or another. Karen's breath hitched. Her father? She hadn't heard his name in years. He had died when she was young, and she had never known the details surrounding his death. All she had ever known was that he was a quiet, hard-working man. He had kept to himself, and Karen had always thought of him as an ordinary man with ordinary struggles. She had never suspected anything more. Your father's debt wasn't just about money, Simmons continued, it was about a lot more. The people he owed were tied to the same criminal underworld that Mrs. Lancaster had become entangled with. And when your father died, they didn't forget. They knew that you, his daughter, would be the next target. Karen's mind was spinning. It was impossible. She had grown up believing her father had been a simple man, just trying to make ends meet. How could he have been involved in something like this? And how did Mrs. Lancaster fit into it? What was her connection to these people, and why was Karen being dragged into this web of lies and danger? Simmons' next words were like a punch to the gut. The officer you shot, Karen, he wasn't just any cop. He was working undercover. Daniels had been investigating your father's past, trying to track down the people who were still after you. And when he started getting too close, he made a fatal mistake. He came to warn you, but you didn't know that. You only saw him as the enemy. You thought he was just another cop out to get you. And that's why you pulled the trigger. Karen's head was spinning now. Officer Daniels, undercover? She had never suspected him of anything more than being another part of the police force, questioning her every move. But now, it all made sense. The pressure, the constant interrogation, it had all been part of a bigger plan, one she had never seen coming. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a pawn in a much larger game, a game that had been set in motion long before she ever stepped into the police station. She had been used, manipulated, and now, she was trapped in the very web she had unknowingly become part of. Simmons leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. You didn't know any of this, did you? You thought you were just a witness, someone caught up in a murder investigation. But Karen, this is much bigger than you. And now, you have to decide how deep you're willing to go to uncover the truth. Because the real question is, who is really behind all of this? Karen's mind reeled as the room spun around her. Everything she thought she knew, her father's death, her neighbor's murder, her involvement in the shooting, it had all been a lie. The truth was far darker, far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. And now, she had to find a way to survive in a world where she was both the hunter and the hunted. The twist was only the beginning. The room felt suffocating. Every corner of the interrogation room seemed to be closing in on Karen, the walls pressing against her chest as she tried to make sense of the flood of information Detective Simmons had just revealed. The truth, the real truth, was still unraveling before her, and it was like a cruel, twisted version of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The weight of the entire situation had become too much to bear. She sat in stunned silence, her hands still trembling as the detective's words hung heavy in the air. You didn't know it, Karen, Simmons had said earlier, his voice calm but laced with a steely edge. But you've been a target your entire life. Your father's past, Mrs. Lancaster, Officer Daniels, everything was connected. You're at the center of it all. Her heart raced, her breath shallow and unsteady as the full scope of what had happened hit her like a freight train. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a panic-induced mistake. It was a well-laid trap, one that had been set years before she even realized it. And now, here she was, at the eye of a storm, caught in a web of deceit, violence, and murder. But even as she tried to grasp the magnitude of what Simmons was telling her, one thing became abundantly clear: her life had just changed forever. The detective leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "Now, Karen," he said, "I need you to understand something. Officer Daniels didn't just walk into that station to arrest you. He was undercover, investigating your father's connections. He had a plan, and you were caught in the middle of it." Karen's chest tightened as the detective continued, the words cutting through her like shards of glass. "He knew about your father's debts. He knew about the criminal syndicate that your father had worked for. And when he started digging, that's when they realized they had to eliminate him. But Daniels wasn't just going to let them win. He tried to warn you, tried to get to you before they did. But you..." Simmons' voice softened, but there was no compassion in it. "You thought he was your enemy." Karen closed her eyes, the weight of her mistake crushing her. She had killed a man. A man who had been trying to protect her, who had been working to unravel the very web of lies that had been spun around her for years. She had killed him out of fear, out of confusion, because she thought he was just another officer out to bring her down. But now she knew the truth. And the truth was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. A cold chill ran through her body as Simmons' words sank in. She had been living a lie. Her entire life had been shaped by the choices of people she didn't even know. She had never been a bystander in this story, she had been a pawn in a much larger game. Her father's debts had followed her, and Mrs. Lancaster's involvement, once hidden in plain sight, had only served to further entangle her in a criminal network she had never asked to be a part of. Karen's hands clenched into fists on the table, her nails biting into her palms. It was too much to process. Too much to take in. She felt like she was suffocating, drowning in a reality that was not her own. And then, a sudden realization washed over her like a cold wave: she wasn't alone in this. "Detective Simmons," Karen said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're not telling me everything, are you? There's more. There's someone else involved in all of this. Someone who has been pulling the strings from the shadows." Simmons raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His silence was the answer. Karen's mind spun wildly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a horrifying pattern. The syndicate, her father's debts, Mrs. Lancaster's secret life, everything pointed to one undeniable fact: there was someone much more dangerous than she had ever imagined who had been orchestrating everything from the beginning. She could see it now, how it all fit. The moments that had never made sense, the things she had brushed off as coincidences or paranoia. But now, the fog was clearing. And with that clarity came an unsettling truth. Her father had made a deal with a criminal organization, a deal that had cost him his life, and in turn, had cost her everything. The debts had never been paid. And now, the people he had owed had come for her. It wasn't just the police that were watching her. It was much bigger than that. They had been watching for years, waiting for the right moment to make their move. And now, that moment had arrived. Her chest tightened as the realization hit her. They had used Officer Daniels to get to her, and once they had him out of the way, there was no telling what they would do next. She was just one piece in a much larger, much more dangerous game. A sudden pounding at the door startled her, snapping her out of her thoughts. Before she could react, the door burst open, and two more officers entered. Their expressions were unreadable, and Karen's stomach dropped as they approached her, one of them reaching for her wrists. "Karen, you're under arrest for the murder of Officer Daniels," one of them said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she stood frozen, unable to react. This was it. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt surreal, like an out-of-body experience. The walls of the room seemed to spin, and her vision blurred. But just as the officers moved to cuff her, Simmons stood up abruptly, raising his hand. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. The officers hesitated, their hands still hovering near Karen's wrists. "Detective?" one of them asked, clearly confused by the interruption. "I need you to listen to me," Simmons said, his voice now filled with authority. "This woman," he motioned toward Karen, "isn't the person we're looking for." Not entirely. Karen's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Was Simmons turning on her? "We're not arresting her," Simmons continued. "There's more to this than she even knows. We have a much larger operation on our hands, one that's been pulling the strings for years. And Karen, she's not the murderer. She's a victim in all of this." The officers exchanged confused glances, but Simmons didn't back down. "Take her off the table for now. We need to take a different approach." Karen's pulse raced. Was this some kind of last-minute ploy? Was Simmons protecting her, or was he playing a dangerous game of his own? As the officers hesitated, Karen felt a sliver of hope. Was it possible? Could it be? Had she truly been caught in a web of lies so tangled that the real culprits were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again? The room fell silent as Simmons turned to face Karen, his expression unreadable. "You don't know the whole truth yet, Karen. But you will. And when you do, everything will change." For the first time since she had walked into this nightmare, Karen felt like she might just be able to breathe again. The truth was coming. And she was finally going to fight for it. Karen sat alone in the small, dimly lit room of the courthouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The trial had ended, and the verdict was in. Her fate, for better or worse, was sealed. But as the door creaked open, she didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The officers had finally left her alone after weeks of questioning, arrest, and interrogation. Now, all she had was time to think. Her mind wandered to the last few weeks, everything that had happened since the moment she had pulled the trigger. The chaos, the confusion, the lies, everything had spiraled out of control faster than she could have imagined. The truth had come out, but it wasn't the truth she had expected. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels or Mrs. Lancaster. It wasn't even just about her father's debts or the criminal syndicate that had been pulling the strings. No, it was bigger than that. The revelation that she had been an unwitting pawn in a much larger game hit her hard. The shock of finding out that she had been targeted for her father's past, manipulated into a position where she felt cornered and alone, was something she would never forget. But even now, after everything had been laid bare, Karen wasn't sure if she was grateful for the truth or if it made things worse. The truth had freed her in one sense, but it had also stripped her of her innocence. Karen had been acquitted of the murder charge, but the court of public opinion still saw her as guilty. She couldn't shake the looks from the people in town, the same people who had once whispered behind her back, who had judged her without knowing the whole story. There was no real peace for her, no clean slate. No matter how many times she told herself she had done the right thing, no matter how much she tried to convince herself she hadn't been the villain in her own story, the lingering doubt never left her. The person she had shot, the officer who had been there to protect her, wasn't just a cop. He had been an undercover agent, sent to uncover the criminal network tied to her father's debts. Daniels had been trying to get to the truth, just like Karen had, but she had seen him as an enemy, a threat, and in the heat of fear, she had shot him. She had made a decision in a split second that had changed everything. But that wasn't the end of it. The people who had been behind it all, the ones who had orchestrated her father's downfall, the ones who had used her as a pawn in their game, had been watching her the entire time. They knew she was a loose end, one they had to clean up. The trial may have concluded, but Karen knew that the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The words of Detective Simmons still echoed in her mind, "You're not the murderer, Karen. You've been a victim in this whole thing. But your life isn't over yet. The truth is bigger than you think, and now you have a choice. Do you let them win, or do you fight back?" She didn't know what fighting back meant, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let this be the end of her story. She couldn't just walk away and let the people who had manipulated her go free. Not when everything she had gone through was because of their games. The lies, the manipulation, the guilt, they had all come from someone else. Someone who had known how to exploit her weakness, her fear. But Karen also understood now that she couldn't do this alone. She had spent so much time thinking she was alone in the world, that no one cared about her, but she had been wrong. There were people who cared, people who had fought for the truth, like Simmons. And though she had to fight the town's perception of her, she had to fight her own inner demons too. Her life would never be the same. She wasn't sure if she could ever go back to the way things were, or if she even wanted to. The quiet life she had once lived felt like a distant memory now. But perhaps that was the point. Maybe the world wasn't meant to be black and white, with simple answers and clear-cut paths. Sometimes, we aren't the villains we're made out to be. But that doesn't mean the world will give us the chance to prove it. The truth had saved her from being convicted, but the truth didn't save her from the consequences of her actions. Karen knew that she had a long road ahead of her. There were things she still needed to face, things she couldn't run from anymore. The people who had caused all of this were still out there, and Karen wasn't going to let them get away with it. But as she sat there, staring out of the window at the bleak horizon, she realized that perhaps, in some strange way, this was the beginning of something new. The road to redemption, if there ever was one, wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't come without sacrifice. But as Karen stood up and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever lay ahead, she understood one thing: she wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. She would fight for the truth, fight for her future, and most importantly, fight for herself. And as the door closed behind her, Karen couldn't help but wonder, would she ever truly escape the past, or was it destined to follow her forever? The questions lingered, unanswered, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them head-on.